Okay, so you're going to hear a loud creaking of a door in a couple minutes, but that's okay. Just follow along. So we're going to start by trying to identify how we might classify peoples or regions anywhere. What makes one, for example, a European? We can think about things like cultural aspects, like linguistics. But in Europe, of course, you have people who speak multiple languages. You've got countries representing 20, 30 plus languages in the European Union, or in Europe in general. So that probably doesn't work. What about ethnicity, belonging to some sort of common group? Maybe, but if we're going to call the Europeans an ethnic group, well, that probably won't go over very well in France and Poland and in Russia or anywhere else. We can look at broader characterizations of culture, such as religion. But again, you've got major differences. You've got Orthodox Bulgarians, you've got Protestant Germans, you've got Catholic Portuguese and Spaniards. And what about the Turks, who consider themselves European as well, to a certain extent? Which brings us back to geographical areas. We could talk about the landmass, but who says that the cutoff for being European should be at the Urals? Should the vast majority of Russians who are beyond the Urals not feel themselves European? Should the vast majority of Turks who are beyond the Isthmus also not feel themselves European? We can look at norms and values of democracy, but until recently, many Europeans didn't have this. So again, all these sorts of things are ways of trying to classify people and regions anywhere. So linguistics, ethnicity, culture, land and geography, norms and values. What makes one American? Values, geography, linguistics, but many Americans don't speak English. So you can identify flaws in all these. So we'll look at a few variables you might use to create a regional identity in Central Asia. And the first one, I'll probably look at history first, and then we'll talk about culture and then geography. So we'll start with history. And what we're trying to do is look for sort of historical similarities between the various states of Central Asia. And we can start by looking at the conquerors and their legacies. The Central Asian steppe has been crisscrossed by armies for millennia. Alexander the Great came through in 329 to 327 BC. The Chinese traders were there in the 2nd century, trying to link India with the West through this Silk Road. The picture that you see here, first the Turks came and then Arab tribes arrived in the 6th century AD. The Turks came by the 9th century. The Mongols came in the 13th century and they incorporated many Turkic tribes, and they picked up the pace of Turkicization of the language. Amir Timur, Turco-Mongol, who's now a hero in Uzbekistan, created an empire that spread from China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. There's also been much cultural influence from Iranians. Though they remained in Central Asia largely Turkish-speaking, they adopted many elements of Persian culture, thanks to the Persian Empire's spread, including with respect to family life and religion, although they took up Sunni Islam, started in the 8th century, rather than Shia Islam. Historically, they've used the Arab script, again, another remnant of a previous empire. And there's been a strong emphasis on education, especially in what we call the oasis cities, which we'll come to in a few minutes, the cities that grew up on these areas that actually had water. So which invaders are we missing? Well, we've got the East, we've got the Mongols, we've got the West, we've got Turks and Arabs. What we're missing here, of course, is the invaders from the North, the Russians. And Russia pushed back against the Mongols by the 15th century. And at that point, it began to expand south as they pushed the Mongols out. So the Mongols had occupied Russia in the 13th century. As they began to push the Mongols out after a couple hundred years of what they call the Mongol yoke, they begin to push further south. And by the 17th century and the 18th centuries, Russians are moving further south into Central Asia. What this means is restricting grazing territory for the people who are actually living there. So by 1718, the Russians build their first outpost at a fort at Semipalatinsk, followed by Orenburg in 1736. So in the early 1700s, you've got the rise of Russia. So looking at all this, you've got this very tumultuous history. And here's why this matters when you're trying to look for a regional identity. History is manipulated. We come up here into the Soviet Empire, And this is a really weird picture of the Soviet Empire. Various definitions of where the Soviet influence was is what this picture really is. It's not the Soviet Union's geographical limits per se. So the reason history is so difficult as a unifier is that history is manipulated. People, and especially political elites, like to take the pieces that they want and bury the others. And then subsequent political elites may find that those other pieces were more advantageous to them later on, and then they rewrite everything. In other words, history is used to justify present circumstances. Where you have a very messy and diverse region in Central Asia, as you've seen all these people crisscrossing the region, this is only easier. History is often used selectively to reinforce national myths. In Central Asia, you don't have unification, a unified history on a regional level, but you've got lots of mixing and matching. People in the Fergana Valley, let me go back to the map over here. So this area here is known as the Fergana Valley. Okay, this large area right here. And I'm going to pause right now for 1 second. So here's actually a better map. You can see the Fergana Valley is over here. So it goes into parts of Kyrgyzstan. It's primarily, it's over here. It's primarily in Uzbekistan, but there are parts of it that are over here in Tajikistan, parts of it in Kyrgyzstan. So if we look, people in the Fergana Valley, part of Kyrgyzstan, might actually have more in common with Uzbeks or even Tajiks sharing that valley than they will with Kyrgyz in more mountainous areas who have adopted a different culture. So an example of this outcome is, let me get a different picture up here for you, is shared historical figures. How do you divvy up the great Islamic scholars who lived around Central Asia? Often in Central Asia, rulers subscribed to a territorial view. You were Kazakh if you lived in what is now called Kazakhstan. So you build a museum where whoever this guy was born, you build this museum there, and you follow the sort of he was one with the land where the museum now stands principle. And you're left with this lawful error dilemma. If history is meant to justify present circumstances, the borders that we have right now, then you have to do lots of fishing and engaging in what we call historical design, picking and choosing what works best, and not necessarily choosing the most accurate depiction. So the picture you see here, Mir Alisher Novai, is a famed, highly celebrated Uzbek poet. But in reality, he was a Uyghur who lived in a town that the Uzbeks only subsequently invaded. So he's really an Uzbek in retrospect, thanks to a subsequent conquest in the area that he inhabited. So again, this is this historical manipulation because of this messy and very diverse history. So tough to look at the region in those terms. We can also look at the region in terms of geography, or at least we can get a couple major clumps here. So spatially, obviously, this is a region. But what about in character? How does geography influence all this? And so I'll start off with a little geography-based theory, and this is sort of theory light, that I heard in South Africa once by a black South African who was talking about how people in the South, in the Southern Hemisphere, are lazy. And the reason they're lazy is they've got the luxury to be lazy. They can relax, they can enjoy life and, pick their fruit and go hunting and do whatever they need to. Versus the Europeans who were in this dreary, cold, dark north, who were much more prosperous than those in the fun, warm, and sunny south. But just because they had to work hard. And they work hard as in they were stuck in these little prisons known as houses for their entire winter, and they had to tinker around and try to come up with new things to make life better. Versus down in the southern hemisphere where life was already great, they didn't have to worry about these things. The level of living standards is highest in Europe around the North Sea, which is this stormy maritime climate, which, according to Huntington, for example, favors mental activity, inventiveness. If you look further south in Europe, in the Mediterranean area, for example, you have a much lower level, or a significantly lower level of development. Some of the poorer countries, Spain, Italy, of the European Union. Of course, it's all relative. But so this argument is that geography can help determine the path that people are going to follow. Of course, there are significant problems with this. What if I said, for example, that Californians are the happiest because they have so much sun? Well, there are lots of other independent variables or potential reasons, that's what an independent variable is, that could explain that. Maybe access to trade routes, natural resources, maybe culture or religion or something else. So that's just one thing to sort of keep in mind. Now I want to go back to Central Asia's geography. Oh, you know what? I'm going to take this on a different set of slides because we're already 10 minutes in. If I can figure out how to stop this. And I will figure this out by clicking on it.